let's say I'm a woman, and there's some male stalker, and he's coming after me, and he's threatening me, and he's yelling at me, and he's wanting to do stuff to me. Oh, police, can you help? No, well, ma'am, we can't really do anything unless he does something. Well, I can get a gun quicker now, and I can defend myself.
Yeah, permits, Jack, can take up to 8 weeks in some states. It's like, well, she might be dead by then. Ron DeSantis delivers a huge Second Amendment win. NATO gets a new member and some quick hits. Welcome to the Base Politics Podcast. I'm Brad Polumbo, here with guest host Jack Hunter. Let's get into it. Jack, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you today, Brad?
Not too bad. A little bit of turmoil in my soccer world. The Chelsea, which is the team I follow, just fired their coach.
Oh, no.
And so now we currently don't have a coach. So we'll have to see how the season's kind of over for us anyway. We've mostly lost the big competitions we were in. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but I wasn't a big fan. So I am happy to see him go. What's new in the exciting world of wrestling?
Oh, I'm staying busy. It was the end of WrestleMania week on Sunday night, which is a whole week for people who pay attention to this nonsense like I do, or as weird as I am. And WWE absolutely made the wrong call, and the wrong person won Sunday night, and I'm very upset about it, and that's where we're at. So I guess we're both disappointed in our fandom.
So I heard about some influencer who got offered like $10 million or something to do WWE and turned it down. And I was like, what? I would gladly do it for a lot less than that.
For sure. Logan Paul, who many people know does the YouTube fights.
Mm-hmm.
He was on WrestleMania and doesn't need the money, and he does it. He's actually a natural at it. But yeah, they're always reaching out into Hollywood, influencers, and trying to expand their reach. And I'm with you. I would have done that and more for certainly 10 million or less than that.
All right. Well, one person who has yet to do WWE, but I guess you can't rule it out completely, is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is down in the Sunshine State, just making policy moves that piss everybody off, it seems. But sometimes he's over the bullseye, and that's at least my take on what he's just done. As Governor DeSantis just signed into law a bill enacting constitutional carry, permitless carry of concealed firearms in his state, to much fanfare. So here's what we've got going from Fox News reporting. The U.S. now has a majority of states with constitutional carry laws on the books after Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill into law Monday that eliminates the requirement for an individual to obtain a permit to carry a concealed firearm. The Florida Senate voted 27-13 last week on the constitutional carry bill, sending the legislation to DeSantis, who signed it into law on Monday morning. There were already 25 states that had permitless or constitutional carry laws on the books, meaning Florida tipped the U.S. into becoming a constitutional carry majority nation. The law allows eligible citizens 21 years of age and up to carry without asking the government for a permit and without paying a fee. So, a few things to clarify first. Background checks are still required for all guns purchased at a federally licensed firearms dealer. Private properties and stores and restaurants, etc., can still put up signs and say guns aren't allowed on our premises. And prohibited people, like violent felons, are still not legally allowed to carry guns. And if they're caught doing so, they can be arrested and sent to jail. All this means is that you simply don't have to jump through hoops and pay big fines in order to exercise your constitutional rights. But Jack, as you can expect, this has prompted a little bit of hysteria on the progressive left, I might imagine.
Well, yes, and that's not unusual for them. Let's read through some of the social media reacts to Governor DeSantis, them passing and him endorsing and signing the constitutional carry. This is from the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre. I don't know. I'm a guy from South Carolina. Don't pronounce things correctly all the time, but she said, "It is shameful that so soon after another tragic school shooting, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law a permitless concealed carry bill behind closed doors, which eliminates the need to get a license to carry a concealed weapon. Carlos Gomeri Smith says 77% of Floridians oppose permitless carry. That's why Ron DeSantis just quietly signed into law, hoping you wouldn't notice. Now people can carry hidden, loaded guns in public crowds without any training or criminal background checks. In all caps, Floridians will get killed. And then we have one more here. Let's see, Fred Gutenberg. I have said often that Governor Ron DeSantis is a fraud and weak. This morning, without announcement, he signed permitless carry. He was afraid for Floridians to watch. Ron, your weakness won't make you less responsible. The inevitable next shooting will happen because of you. So, where do you even start with this? Florida, DeSantis doing this makes it a majority of United states in America that now have permitless carry and conceal, correct? If you look at those states, gun crimes have not gone up. I would say, first and foremost, and I'm talking to everybody listening out there, do you know people, Hannah's talked about this, people who come at you, threaten violence, harassment, whatnot, and you go to the authorities and they say, well, unless they've done anything, we can't really do anything, right? This allows somebody to defend themselves in a easier and quicker way than if they had to jump through all the regular hoops. This is not no regulation. This is not, there are no rules or laws whatsoever, which is what these commenters are basically saying. The gun control crowd basically thinks that every mass shooting, school shooting, any of these, if Republicans would just vote for this one law that we support, none of this would happen, and they won't do it, and they're scumbags for not doing it. That is their emotional response. I think it's absolutely disgusting because they demean the victims every time they do this. But what Ron DeSantis is doing, the states that pass this are actually doing the opposite. So let's say I'm a woman and there's some male stalker and he's coming after me and he's threatening me and he's yelling at me and he's wanting to do stuff to me. And oh, police, can you help? No, ma'am, we can't really do anything unless he does something. Well, I can get a gun quicker now, and I can defend myself. That's the gist of this. That's the reason for this. Well, that's why it
Yeah,
matters.
permits, Jack, can take up to 8 weeks in some states, months
Right.
in some states. It's like, well, she might be dead by then.
Exactly. And that's the point of this. And once again, and we have the data and the notes we shared before the show. In the states where this is allowed, Vermont being a prime example, gun crime has not gone up. We can't prove that it's gone down because the data isn't there. We're not going to be liars on the show. We're not propagandists, but it certainly hasn't gone up. And these fear mongers on the gun control left that say it is and it's going to happen and people get killed just don't have any data to back that up. They're just playing politics and making them feel good in their partisan leanings.
Yeah, they are. And the attempt to connect permitless carry to school shootings is particularly dishonest because in almost no case are school shooters somebody who got a permit to carry a gun. And then also, even when you have a permit to carry a gun, they're not allowed on school grounds anyway. So it's like, oh yeah, if there was a permitting requirement, that school shooting wouldn't have happened. Is just such an absurd suggestion. The idea that these are connected in any way, like somebody who's about to commit a mass murder spree is going to be stopped because, well, I have to wait 8 weeks to get my permit. Or, well, the government said I can't have my permit, so I guess I can't do my mass kill. It's just such a obviously absurd and silly notion. And I'm so glad you brought up Vermont because that's my favorite example. I mean, progressives and elected Democrats, they act like this is some radical policy, some radical fascist. I've heard them call it fascist, which is deeply ironic on multiple levels.
The opposite.
But yeah, it really is the opposite. But like Vermont, the deep blue state with very low rates of crime, is not exactly a right-wing hellscape, and it has permitless carry. This is actually something that's in place in the majority of U.S. states, not just a few crazy red states. And honestly, it doesn't really seem to change that much. There's some research from pro-gun researchers who say it reduces violent crime, but there's some other research that says it really doesn't. But I don't really know, like you mentioned. But what it certainly doesn't do is lead to some rash of mass shootings or spike in crime or anything. A Rand Corporation review of the available studies found no evidence, inconclusive evidence behind that claim that it increases gun crimes. And it's just something you hear so much, and they don't really feel the need to actually justify the fear mongering. They just say it will. Like the idea that People are just going to start walking around and shooting up crowds. It's like, again, half the country already has this. And in basically every state, there were these same panicked doomsday warnings, and none of them came true. And it's just tiring. It's honestly just exhausting to have them constantly with this doomsday rhetoric. These are the same people that told us net neutrality repeal would destroy the internet as we know it. Nancy
Right.
Pelosi said Donald Trump's tax cuts would quote unquote kill people. And it's like you really discredit yourself and any occasions where you might have a legit criticism or point when you're constantly using this doomsday alarm. And people on the right do this too, but I think it's
Of course.
particularly pervasive on the progressive left. This doomsday rhetoric about every policy you don't like. Just give me a break.
They do, and I would say the gun control crowd in particular, that is so deep seated on the left. Like when these mass shootings happen, these tragedies, they use the victims as an excuse to make themselves feel good about their partisan leanings. That is the most important thing. If only the Republican you liked would have voted for some law that they don't even know what it is, this wouldn't have happened. That's just simply not true. Fun fact, since we were talking about Vermont, obviously Bernie Sanders is a senator from Vermont, an independent who usually caucuses with the Democrats. Before he had national aspirations in running for president, he had a pretty good NRA rating. A lot of people don't know that. He had a very good
Hmm.
rating from the National Rifle Association. Hillary Clinton used that against him in 2016. And the reason why is Vermont is a rural state. They have guns in rural areas. It is very blue. It is very Democrat. It is very progressive. It's a wonderful state. I've been there a couple of times, but they like their guns. And their senator represented people who like their guns. And when he had national aspirations, he had to back off that because of the National Democratic Party and their own silliness.
Yeah. And I will say, like, to the people out there who are wondering, well, why can't we just have concealed carry permitting processes? I don't think it's crazy. Like, I used to not be fully on board with constitutional carry because it seemed pretty reasonable to me. Okay, if somebody's going to carry a firearm, they should have to do, a training course. We should be running a background check on them, although almost all gun purchases have background checks at the point of sale. But it seemed like not wild to me that we would have
Yeah.
this process. And that's what constitutional carry kind of does away with. But the more I've learned about it, the more problematic I've realized that process can be. For example, like New York literally got hauled to the Supreme Court years and years later because they essentially refused to give out permits. They gave them out almost to normal people, almost never, only in like rare situations like a celebrity or somebody. And so most people weren't able to exercise their rights because they abused the permitting system to deny them in most cases. In John Lott Jr., who's a pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment researcher, he explained the problems with the permit process pretty well a few years back when he was arguing in favor of expanding constitutional carry in Pennsylvania, because he looked around at how the permitting process had been used. And he found the following. He said the most significant change from constitutional carry is how quickly people can carry a gun if the need arises. Sheriff departments in Pennsylvania try to issue concealed handgun permits within 45 days after someone has met the requirements. If a woman is being stalked or threatened, she shouldn't have to wait for a license. The threat may well be over before the 45 days are met. Or, as I mentioned before, she might be dead, right? Like, to have
Right.
to wait 45 days before you can defend yourself is really not workable. And then he goes on to point out that when the COVID outbreak happened, a bunch of Pennsylvania counties just stopped issuing permits, citing bureaucratic delays, and some were still slow to issue permits all the way into 2021. He says that Philadelphia also regularly revokes permits for such trivial reasons as notifications to the sheriff's office by the permit holder that he is moving to another address in the city, parking tickets, if someone burglarizes your home, and a host of other reasons. Um, so there's all these ways the permitting system can be abused, and then there's also the cost. There's typically a cost associated. So, for example, in Illinois, a 5-year carry permit costs $450. Now, for somebody like me, I could totally do that, right? But you think of a lot of low income people don't have $500 sitting around, and so while only 4% of Illinois residents have a concealed carry handgun permit, in Indiana, where there is no fee, 22% have it.
Right.
So I think clearly there's also people who are locked out of actualizing the right to self defense when you add a permitting system that costs a significant amount of money to get a permit. And if something's a constitutional right, you shouldn't really have to pay up for it.
Yes, and I would add to what, and I agree with everything you just said, and those are very good points. There's a there's something to be said about the debate surrounding this, about the cultures we live in. You could probably tell from my accent, I am from the southeast of the United States, from South Carolina. I split my time between Charleston, South Carolina, and Washington D.C. And I grew up in a gun culture. I'm not a gun guy. I don't have a gun. Maybe I should probably get one, but I don't have one. But I grew up around people with guns, whether it was hunting or just having them for self defense. It's what you have. I like to go to Waffle House. Brad, you're a writer. I'm a writer. I like to sit down, eat some hash browns, some eggs, some bacon, and write a column or whatever we're doing. There's a Waffle House very close to where I stay in Charleston. I go all the time. I know most of the people that work there by name. They know me by name. And about 5 years ago, certainly right before COVID, a man walked in there with a shotgun and demanded money, and he was going to kill everybody in the place. I wasn't there. If he didn't get his money. And a man with a legal gun in my carry and conceal state shot that man. The police thanked the man with the carry and conceal. The employees thanked him tearfully. And who knows what would have happened if we didn't live in a state like mine where people can defend themselves and walk around with guns. That didn't make national headlines. How many times does that happen where it doesn't make national headlines? The only thing that makes national headlines is where somebody has a gun, legal or illegal. And a lot of these mass shooters are very methodical. The transgender woman that shot up the school recently had different targets, had planned this for months. You see what I'm getting at. The debate is so skewed. The people who do the most damage and it makes the national headlines usually plan and work it out, go through all the, that's what they do. And the random things like what I just discussed with the Waffle House, where somebody, a dutiful citizen with a gun that's legal, that saved probably lives and certainly did the right thing, you never hear about it. It happens all the time.
Yeah, I mean, even just broadly, gun estimates of defensive gun use in the United States range between 500,000 to 2 million times per year. And you put that in the context of 2 or 300,000 violent gun crimes. So I've always thought that overall, America's gun culture makes us more safe, not less safe.
Yeah.
But I also don't like when people compare us to other countries because it's not really realistic because we have over 300 million guns in America. So for the rest of our lifetime, guns will be around for bad guys. Even if they were to ban the sale of all guns tomorrow, it would be decades and decades and decades before guns weren't available. Of course, assuming they wouldn't just come through Mexico and our porous border like drugs and everything else does. Um, so the idea that we could emulate these other countries, which have very low gun deaths, but they have other types of deaths and homicides, well, they started at a fundamentally different place than us. So it always seems to me to just be a very unrealistic way of looking at the world. And so I wish people were held accountable too for making doomsday predictions that don't come true. But with the
Yeah.
24-hour news cycle, it's like we've moved on to the next thing by the time anyone remembers what people said about something. So once in a while, you or me or somebody will do like a flashback article about what somebody said about something that has aged so terribly. But aside from that, we don't do a lot of reckoning with all the failed predictions and absurd warnings that never come true. And so people don't realize how often this rhetoric, when they hear it, is actually BS. And so people do genuinely get scared and alarmed. And I mean, I can imagine lots of good faith Americans watching about CNN on CNN or MSNBC, hearing progressive experts warning about the bloodbaths that are coming in Florida, and genuinely being alarmed and concerned. And I hate when people get needlessly scared and when people are
Yeah.
alarmed. People exploit people's fear to get them scared when they don't really need to be, because that's often a tactic of control, but people suffer real emotional and mental anguish because of it.
Yes, it's a business model for mainstream media to get viewers. Believe me, CNN and MSNBC really hope Trump is president again because that's when they were riding high business wise. But it's also what you said, Brad. It's control. You fearmonger. If A, B, and C don't happen, if we don't pass these laws, we're all going to die and everything's going to be terrible. And even if it doesn't come to fruition, nobody's ever held accountable. Related, and we're about to get into this, the same people who think our policy towards Ukraine right now is wonderful, the same people that thought the Iraq war was a great idea. And nobody's held accountable. But maybe that's a segue, Brad. That's up to you. But
Yeah, we can segue. So next up, we're going to talk about we're going to get into Ukraine specifically in a little bit and talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, everybody's favorite. But for right now, let's discuss some news that actually broke this morning, and that is that Finland has joined NATO. So NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is basically a defensive alliance involving the U.S. and a bunch of European countries. Its most important provision is the article that says if any NATO member is attacked, they will all come to its aid in defense. And so now it has a new member. Finland has become the 31st member of NATO, Axios reports, a once unthinkable step that significantly changes the security landscape in Europe. Finland's membership more than doubles NATO's borders with Russia and formally ends Helsinki's decades of official non-alignment. It's also a blow to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who, in launching the Russian invasion of Ukraine, vowed to block the alliance's eastward expansion. It is the alliance's ninth enlargement since its founding in 1949. And of course, the reason this is happening is that Finland, along with Sweden, applied for NATO membership hand in hand after Russia invaded Ukraine last year. Sweden is being held up by Hungary and Turkey, so it's unclear when that will move forward, Axios reports, because all NATO members must approve new members, but Finland has been approved. So, Jack, how did they approach this prospect?
well, Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov on Tuesday called Finland's NATO accession a quote encroachment on Russia's security that would require Russia to take unspecified countermeasures. Putin had previously said that Russia had no, quote, territorial differences with Finland or Sweden, so it was up to them, that's a quote, whether they joined. But Russia would respond to any deployments of NATO military units or infrastructure to their territories. How might they respond, which is the next bullet point? The Russian embassy in Sweden issued an even more pointed warning last week, saying on Facebook that, quote, any new members of the enemy bloc will become a legitimate target of Russia's retaliatory measures, including those of military nature. So, there's a lot to unpack here with Finland joining NATO. Did you have something else to say, Brad, before I start running my mouth incessantly?
Yeah, before we get into our take on all this, let's just include a statement from the White House. President Biden said, today I'm proud to welcome Finland as NATO's 31st ally. He said when Putin launched his brutal war of aggression against the people of Ukraine, he thought he could divide Europe and NATO. He was wrong. Today, we are more united than ever, and together, strengthened by our newest ally, Finland, we will continue to preserve transatlantic security, defend every inch of NATO territory, and meet any and all challenges we face. So that is the statement from the Biden White House. Now let's get into our analysis. Jack, what is your take on this development?
So you have to view this through the lens of American domestic politics, because that's where we're Americans. We're in the United States. We're doing this podcast, and that's how people perceive it. So, if you look at polls, most Democratic voters are more in favor of the Biden policy towards Ukraine currently, because it relates to what we're talking about with Finland and NATO. Putin, Russia have not been happy about NATO enlargement for a half century or more, certainly since the end of the Cold War, when I was a kid, which was a very long time ago. Finland joining NATO in and of itself is not good as far as de-escalation goes, if that's what you want. But it does add to the tension that Russia has long described and sober analysis have long analyzed regarding what we should do, Western powers, regarding Russia. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, in the height of the Cold War, foreign policy strategist George Kennan was always warning that, us enlarging NATO would be a problem. It would create tension between Russia and the United States. In 2007, 2008, there was a skirmish between the country of Georgia and Russia. And the U.S., John McCain, who was running for president at the time, made the famous statement, well, we're all Georgians now. Really? Do you feel like a Georgian, Brad, or is that what we are?
No.
Right. So the subtext of what McCain was saying is he wanted the country of Georgia to be in NATO at the time, of which they're not, because Russia having that skirmish with Georgia would put American troops on the ground instantly. Being in NATO means America's coming to your rescue. That's what it means. It means NATO's coming to your rescue, but who's the largest member of NATO? Who's the greatest funder of NATO? It's the United States. So John McCain, the late John McCain, not trying to disrespect the man who's no longer with us, wanted U.S. troops on the ground there. I could get even a little bit more in the weeds on that. Randy Schuneman was an advisor to the McCain campaign, a neoconservative think tank guy in D.C. Later worked for the Sarah Palin campaign when she ran for vice president with John McCain. He was a lobbyist for the country of Georgia while he was working for John McCain. He was paid by the country of Georgia to help lobby the United Nations to get that country into NATO while working for Republicans in the United States. Do you see the sort of duplicity of how the neocons work on this? So
Yeah,
that
that's
was going
odd.
on then. Yes, it's very odd. Half of the country, it was the South Ossetia portion of Georgia, which is a region in Georgia, identified as Russian at the time. It's very complicated. These are disputed territories. Putin says this every time, and Putin is a bad guy. I'm not a defender of Putin, but it's disputed territories: Crimea, Georgia, Ukraine. All of this stuff, Finland's the latest thing, saying it becomes part of NATO. What you're telling Russia and Putin is America's got your back, screw you, Putin. Does that make sense? Through the lens of U.S. politics, it's we have to defend these people and they should all be part of
Yeah, but
NATO.
I do think there's an important distinction between like Ukraine, which is obviously former Soviet territory being
Right,
added to NATO, and Finland, which I don't is
it's not
not former Soviet territory.
sure.
So it's not disputed. Finland is not disputed territory in the same way that Georgia or Ukraine or parts of Ukraine are. I guess look, I some people in the libertarian or super anti-war camp are super anti-NATO. And I get some of the critiques, but I also on one hand, does adding Finland raise tensions with Russia? Are we scooting up closer to their border? I would say yes. On the other hand, does it decrease the likelihood that Russia attacks Finland? I think also yes, because at the same time, the risk of us getting entangled in a war from the alliance is high. It also makes war less likely in another sense, because if somebody starts a war with any member nation, they start a war with all the member nations. So I kind of have mixed feelings about it. I think when people talk about NATO as aggressive to Russia, I always have a little bit of hard time with that because NATO is fundamentally a defensive alliance. Its
I
military
completely
components
disagree.
are all. You don't think it's a defensive alliance?
Yeah, well, no, I think it's aggressive. The point of NATO after World War II was to contain the Soviet Union, and it's been a long time since World War II. George Kennan, who's the most brilliant foreign policy analysis America ever produced, uh, has said that his entire life until his dying day that this is a grand mistake. You're going to poke the bear. The smartest thing to do to reduce war, if that's the point, that's certainly my point, my hope, because I don't want nuclear war and I like living, is to do what the Progressive Caucus wanted to do just a few months ago and say, hey, maybe we should reach out and pursue diplomacy and not expand NATO and they were shot down by their own party for doing that. That's the stance of anti-war Republicans like Rand Paul or even Matt Gaetz or MTG, who we'll get to later. That's the correct stance. Diplomacy. Ukraine is not going to win this war. Russia didn't get as far as they wanted to. It is a stalemate. And there are world leaders, Brazil's president, for one, who got slapped down by Biden and American progressives for saying, why are y'all funding this and sending more money than you sent to Afghanistan in a year for a war that can't be won and escalating tensions? This is stupid. This is dumb. Zelensky was open to diplomacy at the beginning until he figured out that America was willing to go to long haul and just give them billions of dollars to keep this thing going. So that doesn't make any
I mean,
sense.
I agree with what you're saying, but I was talking about Finland. And I think Finland
Yes,
is kind of a different question than Ukraine.
absolutely. And even the Russian response to them joining NATO is there's no territorial dispute. You're absolutely correct in that. I disagree on the
So
idea that expanding NATO, I mean, Ethiopia could be in NATO and it wouldn't be a problem, but why are we expanding NATO at all? Is my point.
I think so. So let me say what I mean is expanding NATO to include Finland does not seem to me to really be aggressive to Russia. It does seem because NATO's only invoked in a military capacity if somebody attacks a member. It's not. It's not as if Finland attacked Russia, NATO doesn't mean that we all join them. Now, if you were basically expanding NATO to parts of like disputed territories with Russia, I could see how that could be perceived as aggressive. But I guess so. I agree with you. The concerns I have about NATO are more about free riding, to be honest, because the idea of a mutual defensive alliance doesn't feel to me inherently bad. But the US is essentially subsidizing all of these countries' defense because they spend a very small share of their GDPs on defense, essentially knowing that they're in NATO with the US and we way overspend on defense. So the biggest thing I'd like to see is if we are going to be in NATO, the people have to pay their fair share. But Finland actually has a very advanced military, so it would be pulling its weight a lot more than a bunch of the current member nations are. I guess I don't view it as a super objectionable development. Honestly, I don't know. I'm sure
It,
some people will, but
it's signaling. You're absolutely correct, Brad, that it's not going. I don't expect any Russia military action over this or anything, but it's signaling, hey, we're not going to pursue diplomacy. In fact, here's another member of NATO. Imagine if Russia was the world superpower. They were in the United States position now, and Mexico, Canada, and Cuba were members of their NATO. What would our government think about that? You see what I'm saying?
I don't think we'd like it, but I don't think it would necessarily mean that they were being aggressive to us in that Mexico still would not be invading the US anytime, right? Or Canada.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but JFK and the old Soviet Union had a different view of what that looked like in the early 60s.
Well, they were lining up nukes there, right on our
Right.
border. So let me say this. With Finland, it also matters how much of NATO's military presence is then put right in Finland. Like adding
Right.
them to the alliance is one thing, but you'll even notice in the comments we read from Russia, if NATO then puts all its troops right on Finland's border and a bunch of missiles
Right.
aimed at Russia right there, that is obviously escalatory. And so I don't necessarily think we should do that, that would be more similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis in that scenario.
Sure.
But that doesn't necessarily have to happen just because they're in the alliance. There's lots of NATO countries where we don't have them all, on ready alert to go to war.
Right. We do this childish thing where, and we'll get to this when we get to the MTG interview, where Putin is a bad guy. He is a bad guy. There's no apologies for him on this show. But what do you do for that? Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. In retrospect, does anybody think the Iraq war we carried out against this bad guy was a good idea? No sane person does.
Well, a few people do still, but most people
Like I
don't.
said, no sane person does. I don't care what kind of academic credentials they have, but these neocons that they'll think that's a good idea are not sane. Where do we go from here? I agree with the Progressive Caucus letter. I agree with AOC and Ilhan Omar and all those people, Rokana, who wrote that letter and had to retract in 24 hours because of politics in their party. They were writing that letter.
Yeah. Well, so we'll get into Ukraine for our second quick hit and talk more about there. But first, let's turn to a recent kind of viral moment from Ben Shapiro that I want to discuss because this is an important intersection to me after, of course, the tragic Nashville shooting, which reportedly, I mean, we're not actually sure of this, but the shooter may have identified as transgender. Now, a lot of people on the right are like, all of a sudden embracing what are essentially left-wing rhetoric and tactics and saying ban trans people from having guns, I guess. Take a listen to what Ben Shapiro had to say on his show recently.
The gun control narrative is ridiculous in the sense that this person legally obtained the guns. I'm unaware what law would be passed that would have prevented this person from obtaining the guns. I'm perfectly fine with banning people who suffer from gender dysphoria from purchasing weapons. That seems to me a pretty significant symptom of an underlying mental malaise that could theoretically be a problem in terms of owning firearms. But I don't think the left believes the same thing.
So, Jack, I just hate this very idea of taking individual actions and then depriving an individual of their rights because of categorical associations, right? I mean, this same logic could be applied to say, well, men commit the vast, vast majority of mass shootings. Should we ban men from owning guns? Of course not, because self-defense, if you're a conservative like Ben Shapiro, and he's said many times he believes that self-defense is a fundamental human right, and I agree. Well, then how could you possibly justify taking away people's fundamental human rights on the basis of some group demographic they're a part of, irrespective of any individual evidence or any sign that they're actually dangerous as a person? That seems so wrong to me. That's such progressive logic.
It is progressive logic. It depends on what your goal is. So, Brad, we're on this podcast and we're giving our honest opinions about what's going on in the world. And we tend to lean right, but we're not trying to be more right wing than thou. That's not our goal. That's not what we do at Based. We lean that way because that's who we are and that's what we believe, but that's not the goal. If you're Ben Shapiro or other pundits like them, that is a goal. So, if the right is against trans people and, sort of blowing that up and flaming those flames, this is a golden opportunity to be anti trans and to be contrarian in that I'm for gun control for this one group that we don't like to begin with. That's what he's doing. I'd debate him all day about that, but that ain't going to happen. But that's what he's doing. Logically, yes, you're absolutely correct. Look, most serial killers are white men. If there's a bunch of serial killings going on, maybe we should go profile all white men and figure out what. No, that's a destruction of civil liberties. It's an infringement of civil liberties, and most sane people wouldn't argue in favor. People, civil libertarians wouldn't argue in favor of that. The idea that you should deny trans people from self-defense via the Second Amendment is not conservative at all. But if it's beating up on trans people at the same time, that's how he weaves that web they do. And it's shameful and
It's
it's
just
stupid.
right-wing culture war boob bait
Yes,
bullshit.
it's
And it makes me
dumb as
really
hell.
mad because
Yep.
it's a complete violation of their principles. And, their argument is essentially, well, all transgender people are mentally ill and mentally ill people shouldn't be allowed to own guns. We could get into an intense debate about whether people who are successfully transitioned to a new gender, right, on the surface, whether they count as mentally ill or not. But let's say I grant that premise. It is actually totally wrong to suggest that all mentally ill, quote unquote, people should not be allowed to own guns. We allow mentally ill people to own guns. I mean, 1 in 5 Americans will experience a mental illness in a given year, according to the CDC. More than 50% will be diagnosed with a mental illness at some point in their lifetime. I have anxiety issues. I take Lexapro for anxiety. Is there a reason I shouldn't be able to own a firearm to defend my life? From death threats I get from unhinged haters on the internet? Of course not. People have ADHD, mental health. That's a mental illness, right? Should they not be allowed to have a gun? Of course, there are specific disorders like schizophrenia that have higher rates of violence as a correlation to them. But broadly speaking, mentally ill people are not more likely to commit violence. That's not factually or statistically true. They're much more likely to be the victims of violence, in fact. And so the same is true for transgender people. There's this notion that because there's been a couple high-profile transgender shooters, supposedly, in recent years, that there's some over-representation of transgender people in mass shootings. But I saw a pretty comprehensive fact check using 2 different sources proving that's not the case. Here's one of them. Newsweek reports that are transgender people overrepresented in mass shootings. According to the Violence Project, which maintains a national database of mass public shootings dating back to 1966, 98% of mass public shooters are men. Only 4 shooters of the 191 mass shooters in the database are female, and in 2 cases, they acted alongside a man. The project focuses on mass shootings in public where 4 or more people were killed, not counting the shooter. By that definition, only Monday's shooting would be the only case of a shooting by a transgender person in that particular database. So, given that transgender people are about 0.6%, less than 1% of the population, you'd expect them to have about 1 incident in that database of almost 200. And they have about 1 incident in that database. So it's completely proportional to population. They have another one from the Gun Violence Archive, which I actually don't like the way they count mass shootings. It's very misleading. I've discussed it in the past. But that one similarly shows transgender people are represented at very small rates, even relative to their population size. So it's like just objectively untrue to suggest that transgender people are more likely to be mass killers. But here's what I would say. Even if they were, so what? You can't justify depriving individuals of their rights on the basis of collective demographic statistics. That same logic could be used to say something I would absolutely oppose: ban black people from owning guns, because they have higher rates of whatever kind of violent crime, according to some statistics. Ban men from owning guns because they commit 98% of mass public shootings, according to this source. It's like, that is not a logical path. anyone who supports the Second Amendment or gun rights should ever want to go down, justifying depriving individuals of fundamental human rights based on broad assumptions about demographic groups. You're really letting your distaste and disgust for transgender people, which you're entitled to your opinion, but you're letting that override your basic fundamental political philosophy principles when it comes to the Second Amendment. And that's really disheartening to see.
In the United States, American conservatism historically has mostly meant preserving the constitutional order. We have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights, and they are intended to protect us all. That's what it meant to be a conservative for most of the history of the conservative movement in the country we're speaking in on this podcast. We've got to a point where certain segments of the right are like, Constitution, Smonstitution, we're just going to be culture warriors, and we hate trans people, so let's take away their gun rights. We don't like these other things. Who cares about the first, second, 10th, any of the amendments? I feel like people like Ben Shapiro and some others at the Daily Wire more than him lean into that instinct that's sort of new on the right post-Trump. And this is just another example of it. We don't like trans people. Trans are bad.
He's usually better than some of the other people on the Daily Wire, and so I was particularly disappointed to see this from him. Not here, yeah.
He is.
This is a Matt Walsh type take.
No, all that stuff drives me crazy. I'll debate any of those jerks anytime they want to. But like, if you're on the right, you're trying to make money, and that's what they do. You're applying logic, Brad, and I agree with everything you said. But this isn't about that. It's about more than that. It's about gross stuff. Nasty stuff.
All right, well, we'll leave it there, but we support self-defense for all humans, frankly, because it's a human right. And so whatever your opinion is on trans issues should just not be relevant to that conversation. But one conversation that's very relevant right now is one that a 60 Minutes anchor had with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the firebrand, super pro-Trump, MAGA Georgia Congresswoman who previously dabbled in QAnon and some other conspiracies and is now very outspoken. Got to give her credit for that. Well, she had an interview with 60 Minutes that a lot of people on the left got mad at 60 Minutes for even speaking to such an evil person. And I believe in journalism. I would interview the Taliban, right? Like as long as you're doing it in a scrutinizing and accountable way, there is value to speaking to even bad people, quote unquote, especially when they're elected members of Congress who represent, whether you like it or not, a significant chunk of the public. But one interesting moment that we want to discuss is the conversation that Marjorie Taylor Greene had with the anchor about Ukraine. Take a listen.
Let's talk about Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So you're opposed to giving weapons and aid to help Ukraine fight off the Russians. It strikes me that that's what Putin wants.
I don't really care about what Putin wants. I voted for the first resolution to denounce Putin and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What I have voted against is funding a war in Ukraine. The entire time I have been saying the United States needs to be pushing for peace in Ukraine, not funding a proxy war with Russia. We can't afford another foreign war.
If we withdraw our aid right now, then Russia will be right up on the Polish border, and that's a NATO country. And if they attack Poland, we'll have to come to their aid.
I've looked. I cannot find anywhere where Putin says he wants to invade Poland.
I'm asking if that doesn't worry you, and that we'll be concerned to the point that almost will be attacked because we're a member of NATO.
We are a member of NATO, and we have a treaty. Ukraine is not a NATO member nation, but look at us now. We are funding a proxy war in Ukraine with Russia. President Biden is committed, and he said he will go as far as he needs to go to defend Ukraine, and Ukraine is not a NATO member nation. So Russia is going in. Russia is fighting this war with Ukraine, not Poland.
What about the argument that if we withdraw our money and our weaponry now, China will read that as weakness? China will say the Americans can't be relied upon, and it might encourage China to invade Taiwan.
Now you're asking what happens if we just pull out of Ukraine.
Right.
Let me ask you a question back. Why can't we push for a peace deal in Ukraine?
But then
why is war the only answer?
The Russians will be rewarded with territory for invading a country.
I'm sorry, Ukraine is not the 51st state of the United States.
No, but is it right to let him attack another country that's not at war with them, and then you say just let them take what they've gotten so far?
It's not about right and wrong, but let me say this, it's not about
It's
not about what's right and wrong in Ukraine, because we're the United States of America. And again, we have mud all over our face, Leslie. We're $31 trillion in debt. We're not defending our own border. We're ignoring our own people's problem.
So look, MTG has said some stuff elsewhere about Zelensky or about Ukraine that's kind of kooky and I don't agree with. But what she said just in that clip we played, in isolation, she comes off sounding very pragmatic, very realistic and sensible. And I think the anchor, Leslie Stahl, comes off like childishly emotional, like making it sound like, but we can't let the bad guy win. Well, this is the real world we're dealing with, and we have to be pragmatic sometimes. That the idea that Ukraine will fully recover all the territory it lost is not realistic. And you can't make your foreign policy decisions just based on purely childish notions of morality.
Yes. So where do we even start with this? Let's start on the face of it for the audience out there. What you just said, Brad. Leslie Stahl is giving the Biden U.S. foreign policy current position that we have to continue to fund Ukraine forever so they can defeat Russia in Russia's incursion into Ukraine. That is their position. That is not remotely realistic. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I have a lot of problems with and I think is problematic on many levels, everything she said in that interview with 60 Minutes Leslie Stahl was absolutely correct and sane. You can think what you want about MTG, about Marjorie Taylor. Oh, she's crazy, QAnon, and I wouldn't dispute most of it. But in that exchange, she was the sane person. We are sending so much money to Ukraine that we don't have. We are $31 trillion in debt. Did Biden ever go to that? Where was it? In Ohio or Illinois? The disaster.
East Palestine, Ohio. I don't know if he did, but he went to Ukraine first.
Right. Ukraine is the priority. This country that's not the United States. It is not the 51st state, as Marjorie Taylor Greene framed it in that discussion. But we're sending all this money there for something that can't happen to our detriment. It is a U.S. proxy war with Russia. If you think Putin and Russia doesn't think, oh, the United States are involved in this, they just gave him a couple pennies. That's all. No, that's not what's going on. You have to be a complete fool. You have to be Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes to think something that's stupid. Look, Marjorie Taylor Greene on many levels is a crazy person. On this specific subject, we're supposed to think that her saying, maybe we should pursue diplomacy and de-escalate is the crazy position. And the sane position is, let's escalate it more and risk nuclear war. That's what, if you're an establishment type, that's what you're supposed to believe. That's effing crazy. And it's not MTG that's being crazy in this. As far as domestic politics goes, and what Leslie Stahl was saying, and I agree with you, Brad, she sounded childish and pedantic. For those of us who were around for the 2003 Iraq invasion, we were like, this Iraq war is probably not a good idea. This isn't going to end well. And we were a minority, whether you were left or right, mostly on the left at that time. The establishment, the serious people, the non-crazy, you are crazy. Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. He will bully his neighbors. He has weapons of mass destruction. Well, he was a bad guy and did bad things to the Kurds and did all sorts of bad things. But does any of that, in retrospect, justify what the U.S. did in Iraq starting in 2003? You would be a crazy person to think that. And as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, there are some that do, and those people are crazy. I don't care how high profile they are. That's where we're at in this interview. It is the Marjorie Taylor Greenes. It is Matt Gaetz. It is Rand Paul. It is still, thank God, Noam Chomsky, to the degree that the left listens to him anymore, who are making the correct arguments on this. And it is the bipartisan Republican members of Congress, the Democratic Party overwhelmingly, the Biden administration, who are doing the craziest things imaginable to the detriment of the United States. And the only pushback is Marjorie Taylor Greene on 60 Minutes. That's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, it is. And I'll also just say I agree fundamentally with I have a lot of compassion for the Ukrainian people. I think Putin is
Of course.
definitely a bad guy. I think he's wrong to invade, all these caveats that shouldn't be necessary. Everyone basically agrees, except for a few. There are some crazies who genuinely think Putin's a savior and a hero who is
Right.
liberating Ukraine. And
Which is absurd.
they're crazy. But yeah, but within that, I'm not actually sure. So I agree with MTG fundamentally that America's policies should consider the American interest, not the interest of Ukraine. To some extent, the interest of our allies, but ultimately America first. I completely agree with that. I'm actually, though, not even convinced that prolonging the war is in Ukraine's interest. If we wouldn't
It's not.
Ukraine be better off, fewer of its civilians die, peace comes sooner, if they could negotiate a settlement? Maybe they would have to let Russia keep some of the territory they stole. As Leslie Stahl points out, that's not fair. That's not morally right, but it is the real world. It's just like it's like she thinks we live in a fairy tale where they all have
Child.
to live happily ever after. It's childish, the approach to foreign policy she's articulating. The realistic approach, right? I'm a foreign policy realist, is the bad guy might get some of what he wants in a
Right.
negotiation. And you can't hold out for full restoral of all of Ukraine's territory, everything that it's just not realistic. And the longer we perpetuate, I wasn't completely against the idea of sending humanitarian aid, but we have sent so much money. We have sent weapons systems. We have further extended this conflict so long. And on one hand, I'm happy for the Ukrainian people that they've fought back more than anybody thought they could. But on the other hand, what if the war had ended so much sooner? Isn't it possible that we'll fight all this longer and yet we'll end up somewhere kind of similar to where we would have ended up if it had been settled very early on? And then what? All that bloodshed and destruction was for what? So look, that thing, people are roasting MTG over this interview, but I just don't see it. I think that's the elites are out of touch. Most Americans will if they see that clip, they will find MTG the far more reasonable one that was depicted.
If you go into it not having a strong opinion about Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think you're right. If your entire goal is, oh, that's what she says, so I don't like her and that's bad, and who cares if there's a nuclear war? She's crazy, then that's what you'll be, and that's what most of them are.
Yeah, I try to separate it. Like, even if it's somebody I really don't like, try to separate their statement from who they are in general. Because even a wrong or bad person or a dumb person can say something true and correct, right?
Yes.
And also a really good person who's smart, like myself, can say something that is wrong and doesn't. Yeah, I mean, so I really do try to evaluate statements or arguments in isolation more than in the context of who the speaker is and do I like them or not, because that feels to me the most intellectually honest approach. But
Which
we'll leave it there.
puts you in the
Oh, sure.
minority, but go ahead.
Yeah, that does make me a minority, but I advocate that approach for more people. We will leave it there on MTG. Let us know in the comments what you think of this clip and this debate about Ukraine and the other topics that we've discussed today. Now we're going to head to our mailbag and see what viewers on YouTube have had to say. Thin White Axe says, Hannah, I agree with you about bumper stickers, but he says, a magnet I could get behind because you can remove it, but a sticker, if you want to peel it off, you leave a mess and it's just ugly. I do hate like when you peel a sticker, but there's still like sticky crumbs of it stuck to the car. That is kind of gross. So
Yeah, well, Rachel Murphy says, Brad, how do you not know about Space Jam? You need to go watch that ASAP, laughing out loud, making me feel old, ha ha ha. I got to tell you, Brad, I'm far older than you. I know what Space Jam is. I'm not a big sports guy. I know Michael Jordan was in it. I never have seen Space Jam. So we're in the same boat.
yeah,
Just saying. Yeah.
maybe you're too old for it and I'm too young for it. It's
That
like
is,
it was like a big thing for the middle of
yes.
us.
When it came out, I was like, if I was 12, I probably would have saw this, but I'm not 12. I'm a little older than that. That's what it was. So, yeah.
Butter Me Pancake says, yes, it's a tragedy. We should, referring to the Nashville shooting, and we should be sending love to the families of the victims. At the same time, let's take a step back and not start blaming all trans people for one person's actions. There are radical and horrible people in all groups. What matters the most is we find a way to reduce the violence from anyone and everyone instead of targeting any groups. I completely agree with that sentiment.
For sure. No doubt. Agree as well. 84 Chad says, thank you for thinking for yourselves. Well, thank you, 84 Chad. I'm sick of the ideologues that do not want to even consider extreme trade-offs when they don't mesh well with individualistic values. Individualism should be the default, but when there's a huge price to pay for that, we should be more pragmatic until a better solution comes along. I think I pretty much agree with that sentiment.
Scarlett says, thank you for the background on the shooting and trying to be as factual as possible. Always can count on this channel. I would love to see a debate between Hannah and Ben. Can we make that happen? I would say we probably cannot make that happen, but we would be up for it, either of us. But it takes two to tango, and I don't know that Ben or others over there would really be up for it.
This is probably my favorite one we're going to read today. Laughing out loud. This is from Pieman27. Laughing out loud. You two need a real job. I think he's talking about you and Hannah. That wouldn't be me because I wasn't on when they made that comment. But hey, who the hell wants a real job? This is a great job.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's good work if you can get it. To run your mouth and write stuff from home for a living. I mean, I do feel blessed. But yeah, I mean, you just sound jealous, bro. I do include hate comments on unless they're like really nasty or very vulgar. I will include hate comments in our comment roundup. All right, let's move on to hot takes. Jack, let me know. What do you got?
So I'm a big moviegoer. I love the John Wick series. If you like seeing Keanu Reeves run around and whoop ass and shoot people in the head all day long, John Wick 4 is the best of the series. I was a number one guy. I like 2 and 3, but I was a number one guy since it came out a good number of years ago. I just saw 4 last week, and holy hell, it's long. It's 10 minutes shy of 3 hours, and it's worth every bit of time. So if you like that series, please go check it out.
Okay. My hot take is, so people know I don't drink alcohol. And so I will sometimes, occasionally in a social setting, somebody will offer to make me a mocktail, like a virgin cocktail, if they're making cocktails. I've never had one that's good. I've never had any virgin alcoholic drink that actually tastes good. They vary on a scale from gross and disgusting to palatable, but I've never actually had one taste good. So that makes me wonder, is this what cocktails taste like? And if so, why do people drink them? Couldn't you just like drink wine or alcohol straight up or something if you want to have alcohol? Because cocktails, for me, the taste is not there.
I get it. No, I drink alcohol, and I can understand what you're saying still.
All right, guys, that's it for this show. Thanks to Jack for joining us and filling in for Hannah this week. If you're still listening or watching, it probably means you enjoyed the show. So be sure to like, comment, subscribe on YouTube, or leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. Maybe even recommend the show to a friend or family member that might like it. And with that, stay based.